welcome you to tonight's webinar about maple quality in the marketplace today. Folks will be trickling in a little bit, but we're gonna just keep charging right ahead and get started with the webinar. Mark Cannella is going to be watching the chat, so if there are questions, especially technical things that are making it difficult to enjoy the presentation, please pop those in the chat. Also, if you're interested in signing up for more, there's 3 more in this series, and the next one will be on SAP Business Finance. Make sure that you register for the upcoming webinars 48 hours in advance, so it closes at the end of the day on the Monday before the webinar. If you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. Mark will interrupt if they're timely and need to be asked right away. Otherwise, we can do some Q&A at the end. And without further ado, I appreciate everyone showing up, and we'll get started. So just to give you a little background on what we're going to be talking about, this is a project that was funded again through an Acer Access project, and Mark Cannella and I wrote this section of the grant to kind of look at what is the status of maple syrup quality in the marketplace. And specifically, we wanted to do online purchases. We wanted to see really just the basics. How much of the syrup that you order online meet the basic standards for color, clarity, density, and flavor? And then there's some secondary topics that we were curious about, trends as far as how packaging was done, container types, and shipping. Tonight, we're just going to be focusing on the syrup quality aspect, but stay tuned for more information about what we're learning in terms of shipping costs, container types, and really just the nature of how sugar makers have chosen to ship this product. So really what we're talking about are color, clarity, density, and flavor. Those are the fundamental basics of grading maple syrup. They relate to specific regulations and laws across the maple region, and they are written down, and they are something that no matter what size producer, if you're choosing to sell it in the marketplace, you have to meet the minimum standards in these 4 key areas. What is important to remember, though, is that some of these basics, some of these regulations have a very quantitative measure, and others are a little bit more subjective or a little harder to measure. I think we can all agree that flavor is not something that's easily measured in a quantitative way, but things like density, we have instrumentation to do that. Color, typically we'll use a color comparator, and clarity is one of those ones that's not really written down in a quantitative way. The regulations can be sometimes hard to find, so if I've compiled some of them on the UVM extension Maple page, you can go to that. It's a sidebar at that regular Maple page. Just search for UVM extension Maple and you'll get our site. And it's important to realize that there are both state and federal regulations. If you're tuning in from Canada, provincial and federal regulations. For almost 10 years now since the harmonization of the grades, so they're a little less confusing than maybe they were before, but you'll see from the results of our work that producers still struggle in some places to meet these standards. So I really encourage everyone to refresh your memory about what the regulations actually say, how they relate to the products that you're marketing, and just to make sure that you're meeting those minimum standards. And it's not just us looking into this. The Agency of Ag in the state of Vermont has been doing retail inspections for a few years now. Essentially, what it is an inspector for the consumer protection section of the Agency of Ag will go into a retail marketplace, identify that maple is being sold, check a certain number of containers, and really grade them for the basics: color, clarity, flavor, and density. It's not anything more complicated than that. And we're finding, as a result of these inspections, that issues are coming up, and you can read more about it on the agency website. They post the results of these inspections, but just realize that this is part of making sure that consumers are getting what they are paying for. And maple is a high quality product that derives a lot of its value from the purity and the high quality of the product. And if there are defects, it's less likely that you're going to have a repeat customer, and it's entirely possible that consumers will find something else to use for sweetener if they have repeated problems. So unfortunately, the agency has found defects. Color tends to be the most common defect. Syrup that is graded as a lighter grade. So when the inspector goes and tests it, it's actually too dark for the grade and would fall out of the standard. So that's 2021. We won't go too deep into those results, but the work continues. This is actually, I should have changed the title. It is 2022 results, continuing to be an issue. And actually, perhaps 2022 was worse than 2021. There's close to 40% of all samples, or just over 40% of all samples were out of compliance. And color continues to be the number one issue of defect. And as you can see, both years, 2021, 2022, these inspections are done between January and June of the year. And presumably that is syrup that was packaged and produced the year before, but the inspector has no way of knowing how or when that syrup was packaged. It's a bit of an oddity about these rules in that it's the producer's name on the package who's responsible for the product to meet the standard, not the store owner, not the distributor. It's really the producer's name on there. And that can be a challenge for the producer if the retailer is not cycling their product quick enough. So it does seem a little odd that a producer might indefinitely have to expect their syrup to meet the standard, even if when they delivered it, it was fine, and in a reasonable amount of time, it would have been still in grade. With color especially, that is a bit of a challenge. 2022, the state also identified some issues with lead, with mold, buddy, and metallic off flavors. So it's not just color. There are other issues found as well.
Question come in from Meg. For you, Mark, how often would you recommend testing samples from your inventory to double check color?
Right. That's a great question. So we know, and I'll get into the research a little bit later, but we do know that there's a fairly steady rate of darkening in plastic containers. We don't have great data on the darkening in glass containers or honestly darkening in barrels. So it really depends. With plastic, the rate is fairly well known. It's just over 2% per month. 2% light transmittance per month in plastic that is uncoated, and it's about a little less than half of that in coated containers. But I'll go over that data in a little bit. Another issue that comes up in Vermont and is the issue of labeling, but also labeling with a batch code. The Vermont maple regulations require that a producer has a batch code, a way of identifying a particular batch of syrup from all others. And I think that's information that really hasn't gotten widely absorbed by the maple industry. So the inspectors are continuing to find that issue with labeling and lack of batch code. So trying to spread the word about that. The other issue that is perhaps unique to Vermont is that the expectation from the agency is that when syrup is purchased in Vermont, it meet Vermont standards. So this is directly relevant to the project we're about to talk about, in that if you sell syrup into the state of Vermont, it needs to meet those minimum standards. It just so happens that the minimum standards in Vermont for density are higher than all other, at least virtually all other states and provinces. So it is something that needs to be contemplated when you're selling syrup into the state of Vermont. The color breakdown, the ranges for color in the 4 grades of syrup remain the same across all states and provinces, however. One last bit of information before we get into the data and the methods is maple contest judging. It's something that I'm able to do as part of my job as maple specialist. Last year, excuse me, I was helped with 5 different maple contests. These are generally held as with a county maple organization, especially those that have a volunteer sugar house at a county fair. So Orange County, Caledonia, Orleans, Lamoille, and Chittenden County all have sugar houses at their county fair, and they have a maple contest there. And as you can see, the rate of rejection ranged from 25% in Orange to as high as 66% in Chittenden County. Relatively small sample sizes, the most being in Orange with 28 total, and the fewest in Lamoille with 9. All of those contests, the most common rejection was for color, too dark for the grade. And here you see an example of syrup that was entered into the golden delicate category, the standard from the grade kits in the middle, and then the sample, both the sample jar and then the majority of the sample that was entered is on the right. So very much too dark. And unfortunately, it continued again. It's an issue 2022. I've done 3 this year. The Maple Festival in St. Albans saw 49% rejection. Chittenden County was quite high, 62. And Orleans, which actually just happened today, was 52.5% rejection. And, you know, it could be, color is definitely a very common. We saw issues with density, and this sample here had an issue with clarity, with something floating in that sample that was entered. If I could give just one simple bit of information or guidance to anyone entering a contest, well, 2. One would be definitely enter a contest. It's a very cheap way of checking your quality of your product. You have unbiased judges who are trained to judge on the basics, and they're going to give you honest feedback on what your syrup is. So it's a really good idea to enter as many contests as you can. And then the other is always check your sample before you enter. It doesn't have to be hot packed when it's entered into the contest. It just has to meet the standard when the judges judge it. So find out when the judging will happen, enter it right then, and you'll have the best chance at not getting rejected. Okay. So the methods for this project were to order samples of golden delicate syrup and dark robust syrup. And the way Mark and I handled this was ordering from 2 separate locations using the same search terms, and we wanted to make sure we could get a pint of both samples, so we had enough to run it with a hydrometer. Obviously, the way search websites work, you know, they're going to have a slightly different mix of results, but in general, we ordered samples from the highest, the ones at the top of the list, until we filled our quota for samples that we needed to order. We ordered 3 of each, so we had some replication, so we would feel confident about those statistics when we analyze them. So a total, as I said, 6 pints, 2 from each individuals. Mark and I both ordered separately for both golden and dark. And then there are also some unique things in that at least one state in the US does not require grading. I know there are others. And we also want to just keep track of unique packaging, container size. If it wasn't a pint or a pint wasn't available, we also wanted to make note of that. So some of the methods, it's also important to realize that we were dealing with COVID lockdown. So the syrup was purchased between October 15th and November 15th, 2020. The university prevented us from getting right on it as far as access to a space to do this judging. So they were stored for several months. There were 2 different storage areas. One was in a cold storage where it was 33 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, and one was at room temperature, fluctuating between 64 and 68. Interestingly enough, We compared the results. We had two separate groups, cold storage and room temperature storage. In those months from October, November 2020 to March and April 2021, when he did the testing, we saw no differences between those two groups in those same samples, which I thought was a pretty interesting result to throw in the middle of a methods section. But so we did end up getting time and ability to get into a space and do the grading of the syrup in between March and April 2021. So now, again, we don't know when the syrup was produced. Presumably it was produced the year before. So March, April, perhaps some February 2020. So now we're talking 12 calendar months from whenever it was produced to when it's actually being graded. And that's very important, especially in terms of syrup color. And we'll talk about that as we dive into the results. The instruments and the methods used for judging this syrup were no different than you would use in a sugar house, other than, we're not in the middle of production. So we're checking clarity just with a visual examination in the sample bottle. If there's anything floating, anything obvious that of a defect in terms of clarity, then it would be noted and it would be rejected. The regulations, the wording is slightly different in different states and provinces or at the federal level. Most of the language around clarity says something like syrup must be practically clean and clear. Now, that doesn't give you a quantitative measure. There's no instrument, there's no turbidity meter that is used in the maple industry, so we can't compare it to a certain standard. We know that in practice, sugar makers use a variety of filtering methods, everything from a relatively simple technique of pouring hot syrup through a cloth cone filter or a flat filter, all the way up to a pressure diatomaceous earth filter or a filter press. Given that the standard does not say anything specific about a measure of clarity, the interpretation in terms of that clarity is practically clean and clear. So it could, in theory, have a slight haze as long as that haze is uniform and doesn't represent a significant defect in clarity. And again, that's not very satisfying as far as knowing whether or not you're meeting the standard. But in my understanding of that regulation, as long as it has uniform clarity, even if it might have a slight haze, that's acceptable. What's not acceptable is very cloudy or some foreign body floating in that syrup. And it'd be great in the Q&A to have a discussion if this is something people are interested in, because the regulations are pretty thin when it comes to this standard. For density, we used both hydrometers that were temperature corrected, as well as digital refractometers, which were calibrated. And those are the two standard pieces of instrumentation used for measuring density. In color, we used 3 different techniques. We used a temporary grading kit, which is a mix of caramel color and glycerin, which is mixed up every year and sold through the Vermont Maple Sugar Makers Association. It's really important that people highlight that the temporary grading kit is an inexpensive guide to grading syrup color. It is not the standard. It is not a precise instrument. It's a guide. And I think there tends to be perhaps a little bit of over-reliance on those grading kits, because anyone who's used them knows the hue isn't exactly right. There can be a range in redness in pure maple syrup that just isn't reflected in these temporary standards. So really be mindful when you're grading syrup, especially when it's right on the edge between 2 grades, and also recognize that these temporary standards will change color over time. They tend to get lighter over time. So it's really important to know that. And the best practices, if you're going to rely on these temporary grading kits, is to buy a new one every year. We also used a Hanna meter, which is a single wavelength photometer that relies on shooting a beam of light through a sample through a very specific glass vial, and then the sensor reads light transmittance on the other end. The Hanometer is an affordable instrument. People like it because it gives you a precise number. I will throw out a little caution here and say that although it gives you a digital number, there are some issues with the error with these instruments. So there's plus or minus 4% light transmittance. And if you think of a whole grade, Golden is a 25-point range. Each grade is a 25-point range of light transmittance. So plus or minus 4 is a relatively large chunk of that entire grade. So there's an issue there. And then there are things that can happen to the cuvette, the little glass vial, thumbprint, scratched, poorly filtered syrup, hot syrup. All kinds of things can lead to getting an erroneous number. So just see it for what it is. It's an inexpensive way of measuring light transmittance, but it's not foolproof. And then there, in terms of color comparator, there's also the Levibond kit. This is robust in that it's a permanent glass standard, which doesn't change over time. However, it's quite expensive. When you add the whole thing up, including the vial that you need to use, it's over $300. So it's very expensive, probably close to $400 now. And although it doesn't go old, it is a big investment. And not everyone can justify that expense. The last method or issue that we grade is flavor. So the language in the grading regulations talk about flavors being progressively stronger as you go darker in color. Each state and province have a slightly different wording, but in general, lighter syrup is going to have a delicate flavor. Darker syrup will get progressively stronger, and defects, significant off flavors, are not acceptable. And so for all our samples, we followed the same protocol. And just so you know, the regulations are available. I guess I already mentioned that earlier, but if you want to check them out, you can review them there. So we produced a variety of samples, and we had 25 producers able to provide golden, and 28 producers were able to sell us dark samples. Of those, we ended up with 116 usable samples, and for golden and in dark, 129 were usable. Just a little quick shot of how shipping was done. The most common was UPS at 44%. Next most common was the US Postal Service, followed by FedEx, and then just a couple of percent with another method. Where these samples came from, almost half came from Vermont. Next most common location, New York. And then you can see the breakdown. There was some from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Maine, and so forth. That was for golden. And for the dark robust, again, half the samples came from Vermont, and almost a quarter came from New York, and the rest came from other states. The breakdown of state of origin was slightly different for darks than it was for goldens. Now we'll jump into the results. So with clarity was not a huge issue. We had only about 4% of the samples in golden were unacceptable for clarity. And this meant that something, like I talked about in the standards, something floating in the syrup, unacceptable levels of cloudiness, something that rose to the level of failing to meet the standard. In dark, it was the same, about 5% failed to meet the clarity. And I think that's good news, that it's not a huge issue. This is syrup that was packed in both plastic, but also glass, and clarity. It shouldn't matter what type of container it's being packed in, that the samples were by and large acceptable in terms of clarity. Again, color, these are the instruments we used, variety of cost. And here are the results for color. So when you just take the sample at the moment that we graded them, so remember this is several months, let's see, it was close to 5 months from when we purchased them, 6 months actually, we had 0 of those samples graded out as golden, and that would be at 75% or lighter in light transmittance. 80% of the samples were graded as amber, 20% as dark. And that red bar represents the mean value of all the light transmittance of all the samples. Now, I'll come back to these color results at the end when we're discussing the results, but I just want to go through them first. Now for dark, remember the range for dark is between 25% and 50% light transmittance. We found that 44% were actually within that range, and 56%, so more than half, were actually darker than the lower limit for color in dark robust syrup, and were graded as very dark. And interestingly enough, we actually had, at least according to the Hanometer, we had 4.5% had a light transmittance of 0. So no light penetrated that syrup at all, sort of the black hole of maple syrup, if you will. But there were certainly more samples in the dark that met the standard than in the golden. Now with density, like I said, we used a hydrometer and we used a digital refractometer. And just a quick note about digital refractometers, they are much more appropriate device to use at room temperature with syrup. Even expensive digital refractometers like this one that are temperature compensated, they really can't tolerate hot syrup. Even if you let it cool after it's been hot, there can be issues with that tiny little bit of syrup becoming more dense in that sample well. So really, digital refractometers have a place. They're good precision instruments. They can be calibrated, but it's not in the moment of making syrup. They really aren't appropriate for hot syrup. Hydrometer is a much more appropriate tool for in the moment when you're producing syrup in the sugar house. So density for golden, we found that there was a range in densities, everything as low as 64.9 all the way up to 69.7. This is degrees Brix. 38% of the samples in golden were below the range for minimum density in Vermont, the Vermont standard of 66.9. But only 3.4% were below the standard, the USDA standard of 66 Brix. And that's important when we think about where some of these samples came from. And the other interesting thing to note is that of the samples that were below that 66 Brix, 43% were from Vermont. So we can't just say it was producers from outside the state of Vermont not knowing what that minimum standard was. A good chunk of those were actually Vermont producers. Interestingly, there's very few were above the range. Only just under 3.5% of the samples exceeded the legal limit, which is 68.9% Brix. Now for dark, similar, was a fairly wide range. Everything as low as 63.3 Brix and all the way up to 71 Brix. Just as a reminder, if you have syrup that's below legal density, it's more at risk for mold and fermentation and becoming off-flavored in that way. And the higher you get above the legal standard, the more likely you are to have what we would call a supersaturated solution that would result in hard crystals forming in the bottom of that container that would really be unusable to the consumer. So you definitely want to try to hit that 2-degree Brix range, which is the legal range for pure maple syrup. So for dark, of the 8.5 of the samples were below the range for Vermont, but only 5.5% were below for the 66 Brix standard. And of the samples that were below the 66, 91% were from Vermont. So clearly it's not producers from out of state, out of the state of Vermont, not understanding the Vermont regulations. And similar to Golden, we had a few percent that were above the range that were just a little bit too dense. Now for flavor, we found some differences. We found that not unlike the results for clarity, only about 5% of the Golden samples failed to meet the flavor standard. So 5% rejected for some sort of flavor. There was a mix. It wasn't any particular strong trend one way or the other. There was a little bit of buddy, a little bit of metabolism, a little bit of sour. So no significant trends there. And that's encouraging that 95% of the samples were acceptable. A higher percentage of the dark robust samples were rejected for flavor. No clear reason as to why, other than darker syrup has more flavor in general, and occasionally producers may not pick up on the fact that some of that more flavor, which is in those samples, is actually a defect and not just strong flavor. It's actually something that would be identified as an off flavor and need to be not sold in a retail container. So, like I said, the defects included buddy ferment metabolism. There were, I believe, a few sours in there as well, but no strong trends one way or the other as far as which flavor was most common. Looking at container type, we found that plastic was by far the most popular, and this is syrup that is shipped. So you might maybe make an argument that we would see more plastic just because we're shipping the syrup. We're not picking it up in a retail brick and mortar location. Of the plastics, the most common was Sugar Hill, followed by bacon. There was in Golden, 19% was in glass, whereas 15% for dark packed in glass. But in general, about 2/3 were packed in Sugar Hill, with another 15 to almost 20% of no, sorry, 10 to 17% more in another type of plastic container. So essentially 3/4 of the samples we received were in plastic. And that's not necessarily something that the consumer is prompted. We didn't select for a specific container type. We just wanted the syrup in a certain volume, and we get what we get. As far as batch codes, just wanted to remind folks, we did pay attention to batch codes. It was certainly an issue on some of those containers. Regardless of where the syrup is coming from, if you're selling it into Vermont, you need to have that batch code. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. It doesn't have to be an automated labeler. It can be as simple as a indelible marker on the bottom of the container with a code that you specifically come up with. And it really makes good sense in a lot of different ways. From a business standpoint, you can track your inventory. If there's a problem in the retail marketplace after it leaves your location, you can easily identify what day that syrup was produced. And it has implications in terms of food safety and quality. It's really important to maintain good records on when the syrup was made, any issues that you maybe identified, and then where that syrup goes once it leaves your operation. Of course, if you don't have a batch code and can't isolate a certain batch of syrup, and there is an issue, at least in Vermont, the state of Vermont can impound all your syrup until the issue is resolved. So it would help immensely in terms of your business if you can isolate just the batch of syrup that has the defect. When we found that On the Goldens, about 3/4 had a batch code, and just over a quarter did not have a batch code. Interestingly, it was slightly different for dark, robust syrup. A little bit more were missing the batch code, but they were, sort of in the range. So overall, the issues we found, number one issue was certainly color. We did see issues with density, and we're going to talk a little bit about that density data in just a second here, but just want to make sure folks recognize that the importance of these regulations. They're on paper to protect the consumer, their investment in a high quality product. It also helps the maple industry, making sure that the name maple syrup really stands for quality. And the reason these regulations exist, and going back historically, is that there was a lot of fraud. There, early 1900s, there was a lot of quote unquote maple syrup produced that was either cut with cheap sweeteners like glucose or some other corn syrup, or had no maple whatsoever, but was labeled as pure maple. And so the maple industry 100 years ago really responded forcefully to institute these regulations, because you are asking consumers to pay a high price compared to other sweeteners. So these regulations have a place. They still are relevant, and they really do help stand the maple industry apart. So in terms of color, to Missy's question about darkening, there was some research done by Tim Perkins and others at the Procter Maple Research Center, and they found when you had syrup packaged in coated and uncoated plastic jugs, the rate of darkening was about 2.5% per month in uncoated. And actually, I misspoke. It's less than half of that rate in coated containers. So just less than 1% per month in coated containers. So when you calculate back the amount of time from when we did these assessments of color to when we received them, and even earlier to presumably when they might have been canned, we of course have no idea when they were bottled up, but that could explain some of that darkening. And I did a little quick math, and I'll show you that in just a second. So here's the results again of the across the top you have the Goldens, across the bottom you have the darks. Let's look at the color data on the left. So like I said, none of the samples when we measured them in March and April 2021 met that minimum standard for color. However, if you calculated back using that rate of darkening from Tim Perkins' work, we would find that 50% actually would be in grade and 50% would be out of grade. And that's based on when we received the samples in October, November, not when some theoretical date in which they were produced, but actually when we took possession of those samples. So that's better than 50% is better than zero, but it does highlight the fact that some consumers will purchase it and then not consume it right away. So it is something to think about, and some retailers won't revolve their stock very quickly. So if you're selling directly to a retailer, you really need to make them aware of the issue of darkening. It was even better, I would say, in terms of the dark. So if we back calculated based on that pretty linear rate of darkening identified by Tim Perkins in that work, virtually all the very dark strong would be in grade and only 5% out of grade. As far as density, in the Golden, 41, just over 41% were out of the range, but only about 6.8% are out of that international range, the minimum being 66 Brix. And it's similar, only 22% were out of the Vermont range for dark, so it was more compliance there, and just under 10% would be below or outside the range, not just below, it could be above in the international. So best practices moving forward, understand that rate of darkening, it's a real thing. It's a fairly linear relationship, and you can count on that happening once you put it in that retail container. A lot of that darkening is happening through oxidation, so fill height is important. We know from other work that if you leave a huge amount of headspace in your container, even if it meets the stated weight or volume, I should say, of the syrup in that container, that extra oxygen in the headspace can result in some darkening. So one possible solution to that is to fill it right up and then account for that extra weight in your pricing so that you're not giving away a ton of syrup and you are also not having that added effect of extra oxygen in the headspace that can lead to darkening. Understand how instruments work, understand their accuracy, and also understand their limitations. Understand that just because an instrument gives you a digital reading, it doesn't necessarily, it isn't free of error. Understand that not everyone is highly trained in terms of grading. Flavor can be difficult. Make sure you have multiple people tasting samples, and if you have an issue, get a second opinion or a third opinion and make sure that you're not putting substandard syrup in the marketplace. And that pretty much wraps up what I have. I'm excited to hear the questions if Mark has some. I'm going to take off the slide here.
And you did a nice job explaining the different tests we use for color. And then the more specific charts you showed were all based on the Hanna light transmittance. And you discussed that the error factor that's built in, that plus or minus. And can you just explain, I believe that we sort of, I believe we factored that in. I just want to get the explanation right to people, how we factored in that plus or minus 4. I think we gave syrup the benefit of the doubt, let's say,
Yep.
right? We
Yep.
didn't, we sort of, I can't explain if we went up or down with it. But
if it was within 4% of the minimum, then it was counted as acceptable. So,
great.
Yep. And then the other thing that I should have a slide for, but we saw really good agreement across those three grading methods for color. We saw good agreement between the Hanometer, the temporary grade kit, and the Lovibond, which was encouraging because one of them is quantitative and the other is essentially a comparator. The other two are comparators. So we didn't see massive differences in what the Hanna was grading out at compared to the temporary kit. That's what I'm saying.
Great. All right, everyone. I believe that I've clicked it so you can enable your mic. You just have to do that manually, but feel free to use the chat as well.
So I see Nick is asking, was there a difference in grading when sliced by state? So that's one of the secondary analysis we haven't done, but it's a great question. It would be interesting to know. Clearly with over half the samples coming from Vermont, they're contributing quite a bit to the overall averages, and they weren't perfect by any means in terms of meeting the standards. So good question. We'll definitely include that in subsequent work or stuff that we're going to write up as a result of this work.
Do you recommend canning or bottling a whole barrel in one go to prevent mold from developing on the sort of once there's air in the barrel?
Oh yeah. Hey Meg. I think it's entirely possible that you could, once you open that hot pack barrel, it's now no longer hot packed, and that we know that mold can grow on correct density syrup, and that you're just probably asking for an issue by leaving it partial. That does present a problem as far as handling your inventory, right? Maybe you don't have a whole barrel's worth of retail containers spoken for. You have to anticipate how quickly that's going to move. And because especially in plastic, once you put it in plastic, we know it's darkening from the start. But yeah, I would agree that leaving a partial barrel that's open is not ideal. If you can keep it cool, that's going to help some, but it's not going to prevent everything.
Yeah, I'm curious more about the findings on cold versus room temp storage. Are there general best practices on storage over that time, and are you finding data that might challenge those myths?
I mean, I think in general, it's ideal to keep syrup as cool as possible. But it was interesting that we didn't see differences between like keeping it at just above freezing versus a room temperature. I think the issue, it's probably not linear. Probably you start to get towards a temperature threshold and then you start seeing effects. So maybe higher than the room temperature samples we saw. But as far as challenging best practice recommendations, it wasn't really the nature of this project to answer that question. So I wouldn't really propose a big change in practice as a result of this. I just thought it was an interesting thing to include. And I personally, I think I would have expected to see a little bit more difference than we did.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Other questions or, oh yeah, Mike.
What are some of the grading schools that sugar makers could go to? I think Maine has one.
That's a great segue. So I've been working with, just to start off, the Maple Syrup Grading School was a program started by Henry Marcus with the State of Vermont Agency of Ag, Kathy Hopkins with UMaine, and Sumner Dole with UNH Extension. And it's about 20 years now they've been doing it. It's a 2-day intensive training. And it's a great program. I don't know if anyone's on the call who participated in that, but it's a really great training. But it does take quite a bit to hold one of those events. And what we found is that there's a lot of demand for training in syrup quality. And so Jason Lilly, who took over for Kathy Hopkins at UMaine, and I have been working with IMSI, International Maple Syrup Institute, to continue that offering, that 2-day training, but also try to dramatically increase access to training that's not the same 2-day training, but high quality and more accessible. So the idea is that there'll be a kit of samples, both loaners for a county organization or some group of individuals who want to host a training. The samples will go out to those individuals, and the trainers, Jason and myself, and perhaps some other content folks, will come in remotely. And so it'll have a lot of the same aspects of the grading school, hands-on, but it will allow us to offer this training much more frequently than we can with the in-person. If you're hungry for doing the 2-day training, you can go to La Crosse, Wisconsin in October. There'll be a 2-day maple grading school, the full thing there. Jason has offered a 1-day partial training in Maine as well. And we also offer some training at maple conferences. And we're going to be doing one this December as well. But it won't be the full 2-day training that folks who have attended in the past are used to. It's challenging, right? That you want to have the hands-on, you want to have the communication between individuals to work through some of these practices, but it's challenging for folks to travel, and set these trainings up all over the place. So we're trying to split the difference and do kind of a hybrid, and look for more information coming out about when those will be available. We're hoping it'll be a good solution. I will say, just in terms of grading, we do have some stuff on the Maple Extension page. We've got 4 videos, one that goes over the basics of grading color, clarity, flavor, and density. They're about 6 to 10 minutes long. You can check those out. They've had pretty good feedback. I also have some cards, that one for each color, clarity, flavor, and density, which are, it can't diagnose every issue, but on one side of the card, it talks about what the standards are for the color, clarity, flavor, and density. And the other side of the card, it talks about what the most common reasons syrup doesn't meet that standard. So, it could be anything from not measuring the temperature of the syrup when you use a hydrometer, or not hot packing, that sort of thing. Even those little bits of information can really help remind folks about how to make sure their syrup meets the standard. And in the contest that I've been judging, I've been providing those cards to the folks who were rejected from the contest. We have the card to go along with it to hopefully give them a little bit more information. And I'll also say that there's some longer format presentations talking about, there's at least one on syrup, maple syrup flavor, also on the UVM extension maple page. More questions? Where are those cards available? How about I just go right now to the website and I will add the address to the chat. Any comments or questions while I'm searching the page to?
Oh, this is Mark. I'll throw a question in for you, Mark, and for any of the participants to chime in as well. I got to work with you on this project and did a lot of learning myself. From your experience, are there producers that are actually using the HANA meter or the Lovibond kit? Yeah, and how would that compare to people that are potentially almost exclusively using the temp grading kits? So that's a question for you, Mark, and then also to the participants. Like, is anyone using anything other than a temporary grading kit for color evaluation?
So we haven't really taken a survey, like a actual survey that we would say could feel confident in the numbers, but anecdotally, I would say vast majority use a temporary kit. The HANA meter is getting popular because it is only like 60, 65 bucks. I would say very few people use the Lovibond, but those that do like them for the reasons that I already mentioned. It's permanent, just visually it's easier to work with. I think it has a better form function. I think it's a better device, but it is a big outlay of cash to start.
No, that's great. Dan and Dave, both using the HANA and the Lovibond. And for me as a business person, learning the standards for Mark, when I see the $300 for the Lovibond and he says it's really expensive, I'm thinking that's like the cheapest thing in the sugar house for people compared to all the other investments. So it's an interesting sort of relativeness of what investment level people are at. But that's cool that we've got a couple people on here tonight with a small group that are using the alternative color tests. Alternative's not the right word. Additional.
So I just put in the link to the grade cards directly, but also the page that has the grading videos. And you should know that the grade cards have a QR code you can scan and goes right to those same grading videos.
Interesting. Meg's got a comment there. We've used the HANA and the Lovibond, but had some issues with the grades being completely different.
Yeah.
Meg, any clarification? Is that the between the HANA and the Lovibond, or between one of those and the temp kit?
We haven't used the temp kit, although I'm gonna get one this year. We've been using the Lovibond forever, and I just got a HANA. I don't know, just because I thought it would be more accurate, and then they were both like completely off, like a whole grade. And then we ended up grading with the Lovibond, but we sent some syrup off to a contest somewhere, and I think some of it was graded by color, and it was rejected by color. So we were assuming our Lovibond was off. And I think we got it since the grades were changed, so it should be correct from what I'm hearing, but maybe we need another color wheel.
Yeah, I mean, you would know if it says golden, amber, and dark on the wheel, then that would be the most up-to-date standards. When they were first coming out with those wheels, there was an issue, I think, with the golden, like glass chip, but that was so early. I don't even know if they made it in the marketplace. I know they sent some to us at Proctor to check. Boy, again, there's so many things. The HANA meter gives you a precise reading, right? But air bubbles and it can be there are several things that can throw that number off. I guess if I had to go with one, I would probably go with a Lovibond because it does represent the minimum of each grade. But it's interesting that you had used the Levibon and it got rejected.
When
Did you
you're
get a number
testing-
back? Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
No, we didn't.
Yeah.
We didn't. When you're testing with the Hannah, is it better for it to be hot syrup or cold?
No, it should be room temperature.
Room temp.
Yeah,
Okay.
hot syrup is and I don't have the manual with me, but I'm pretty sure they recognize they suggest a temperature range to use. You can
Okay.
the manual's available online, but in general, just things are happening. Things change so quickly with hot syrup. I mean, it's not great to do hot syrup in a grade kit, even a temporary kit, really, just because it can be the density, you have some expansion. It's not huge, but it's different than when it cools. So in general, grading cooler syrup is better. Not always possible, I recognize. So I see Dan has a question. Any assistance, advice with packing larger volume batches in relation to density? I haven't been as happy with the digital read for syrup density. Dan, is it possible for you to unmute and clarify your question a little bit? Are you seeing issues like from start to finish of the batch, across the batch? So are you using a gas-fired, a fairly simple canning unit, or do you have a water-jacketed canner? Seems like that might be part of it, or could be. Steam pan through a press and then water-jacketed canner. And so you're seeing big ranges in density from when you start a batch to when you finish, I guess. Is that just to clarify? Almost 1.5 bricks across. Yeah, that's considering that's almost all the way through the range of density. That's tough. Are you filling one at a time, or do you have multiple fillers going at once that you're just trying to shorten in the time it takes to get through a huge batch? That's a big batch of syrup. At a time. Well, I don't have a ton of experience, Dan, so I'm happy to ask around and try to get you an answer, but I don't have anything. It sounds like you're doing a lot of things that I would expect to be ideal. And you're taking it to 185 Fahrenheit, not some extremely higher temperature. All right, last question. This is kind of funny, talking one and having the text come back. So, but how long does it take you to get through that 160 to 300 gallons? Obviously, it depends on the type of container you're filling and stuff, but how much time do you budget for that? Few hours. Okay. Well, we do have your contact information through registration, so let me try to track down some answers from people who have more experience and get back to you. Any other questions? Well, there's a lot to digest. I appreciate everyone's attention and time and showing up. I know we're coming out of this thing and people are tired of webinars, but we really appreciate your registering and showing up, and there are more, so please don't forget to sign up for the next one. It's going to be about SAP Business, and check out all the past webinars that are available on maplemanager.org. We got a ton of content there as well. And Mark, do you have anything to add before we say goodnight?
No, thanks for the presentation, Mark. It's great to have your knowledge. Thanks for the questions, everyone. And yeah, have a great evening.
All right.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate it.
Take care, everyone. Yep.